That's a government agency aimed at protecting consumers. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has done some good for citizens, reaching multi-million-dollar settlements between credit card companies and wronged customers. But it also turns out the CFPB is part of this revolving door that's constantly turning between government and the finance sector. One of their top guys, Leonard Shannon, is leaving the agency to go back to a corporate law firm. So is this just another example of the cozy ties between corporations and the government? To discuss more about this revolving door, I was joined by Bart Naylor, a financial policy advocate at Public Citizen. Here's his take.
Well, the revolving door, as is commonly understood, is the habit of industry regulators, government officials, going through that door back into the private sector where they appeal for various contributions or regulatory laxity or regulatory favors from the agencies that they just served.
And how common would you say this practice is?
It's so common that it's almost like gravity. Public Citizen counted, for example, in 2009, that there were 900 government officials, mostly former staffers for Congress or regulatory agencies, that were lobbying during the congressional debate over reforming Wall Street.
Wow, that is quite a large number, and want to give a couple specific notable examples here. Dick Cheney is the first one. He is the chief of staff for President Ford. He was also, I want to also point out that the ones in blue are their public posts. The ones in red are their positions held in the private sector. Dick Cheney, as I mentioned, chief of staff for President Ford. He was also President Bush's senior secretary of defense, AEI Public Policy Research Senior Fellow. Back in 1994, he was the CEO of Halliburton, and he was also vice president for George Bush Jr. And our next example there was Jake Stewart. He held several positions in the Clinton administration, the vice president of business development at Alcoa, the counselor to U.S. Treasury Secretary, and he was also the managing director and global head of corporate communications at Goldman Sachs from 2012, and he's still in that position. And we have Meredith Atwell Baker. She was at the Legislative Affairs Office of the State Department back in 1990. Also the director of congressional affairs at Cellular Telecommunications Industry Association. She goes on there to a few more positions. And interesting here, 4 months after voting for Comcast, the Comcast-NBC merger, Baker accepted a job at Comcast. So, Bart, I want to ask you, why become part of a government agency if your intent is to go back to the private sector anyways?
Money is the most obvious candidate explanation. Unfortunately, the benign path would begin with a federal agency. You finish law school or business school, you work for a federal agency, and then you go to work for the private sector that intersects or is overseen by that agency. You'll make 2 to 3 times as much in that agency. For example, one of the higher salaries that you could get at the Securities and Exchange Commission, if you are almost the head of enforcement, is about $160,000 a year. That, by the way, is what a starting lawyer will get if she graduates from Harvard Law School at one of the prominent firms. So the lure of money is certainly there. But the pernicious problem of currying favor with that future employer or advantaging your knowledge of how the agency works for that future employer certainly is a problem that is a problem for public policy.
Can you talk more about that, how this revolving door does affect public policy?
Well, we see it. I focus mostly on the banking business, and there are 2 dynamics that have led to what is, in effect, regulatory capture. And if I can just step back for a second, the Wall Street crash of 2008 happened in part because our laws were deficient, but almost as much because the regulators using the laws that existed were not zealous enough. Why weren't they zealous enough? And the 2 possibilities are that The one explanation is that they were captured by industry. Why? Because they were essentially going to work for industry later, and or they'd come from industry. And then what's we call the Stockholm Syndrome, namely that their exposure, the regulators' exposure, is 99% to other bankers. They get to see us, the consumer side, very, very little, and they begin to speak and think like industry.
That was Bart Naylor, a financial policy advocate at Public Citizen.